"You don't belong here anymore," she said, smiling as she stacked my belongings on the lawn. I didn't respond. I didn't move. I waited, because patience, when wielded correctly, can be the sharpest weapon of all. The morning sun had barely broken over the horizon, but already the air carried a sharp chill. My own home, the place I had spent decades building, felt suddenly alien. Boxes and baskets that once held my life were strewn across the driveway, blankets sagging with the weight of memory. I recognized the betrayal in every deliberate movement, every triumphant smirk that crossed her face. She thought this would break me. She believed that erasing me from my own home was a simple matter. She was wrong. I closed my eyes and inhaled slowly. My heart raced, yes, but not with fear, with determination. Every piece of furniture, every photograph, every hand-stitched cushion carried a fragment of my life, my labor, my love. And no one could take that away from me, not even her. I had watched her manipulate, deceive, and dominate my family with subtle cruelty for years. Yet she had underestimated one thing: the quiet strength of someone who has seen and survived far worse than a lawn full of boxes. Memories of the house flooded me, mixing joy with a bitter undercurrent of betrayal. I remembered the mornings spent washing windows, baking bread, filling this home with laughter and warmth. I remembered teaching my children to walk, to speak, to respect and love. I remembered birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays where every room shone with the care I had poured into it. And now, watching those same rooms stripped and desecrated, I understood fully that legacy is never just material. It is patience, it is resilience, it is the quiet assertion of self. I walked slowly to the edge of the driveway, letting her watch me. She expected tears, an outburst, a sign of weakness. Instead, I let silence speak. I let the weight of decades settle visibly in my posture. My gaze swept over the yard, cataloging every item tossed, every affront inflicted. In my mind, I was already calculating, planning. Every document misplaced, every key left out of order, every seemingly insignificant oversight would become a step toward reclaiming what was mine. She tilted her head, unsure now. There was a brief flicker of doubt in her eyes. Even small cracks matter when built over years. I had waited my entire life for the day my voice, long ignored and discounted, could be asserted without raising it. And this blatant disrespect provided the perfect stage. I allowed myself a slow smile, not of joy, but of quiet satisfaction. Every masterful move begins with stillness. Every strategy requires observation. I knew the house, its rooms, its quirks, every hidden corner where memories lingered, and she had just made the fatal mistake of underestimating my knowledge, my patience, my will. The sound of footsteps behind me reminded me that my children, too, were watching. They had been silent observers for too long, guided and manipulated into believing her narrative. But truth has a way of surfacing, and patience makes it inevitable. I could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken questions forming in their minds. Who truly belongs here? Who has the right to be heard? I would let time answer those questions, slowly, meticulously. For now, I collected the courage that only a lifetime of trials could teach. I began walking through the scattered remnants, touching familiar surfaces, inhaling the sense of home that lingered despite the chaos. Each step reinforced an unspoken declaration: I am here, I always have been, and I will not be erased. Hours passed, the morning stretching into afternoon. She grew restless, her confident posture cracking as I continued my measured, silent procession. I didn't need to speak. My presence, unwavering and deliberate, communicated far more than words ever could. Every glance, every pause, every methodical action conveyed my refusal to submit. She tried to force conversation, but I responded only with calm composure, the kind that comes from knowing one's worth and the inevitability of justice. That night, as the house settled into uneasy quiet, I finally allowed myself to breathe fully. The lawn was still scattered, the evidence of disrespect clear, but the day had proven something critical. I had not faltered, I had not lost control. and I had learned that the most potent form of retaliation is often invisible, delayed, and deliberate. She might have believed she had won, but in truth, I was already several moves ahead, setting the pieces for the day when everything would be rightfully restored. As I sat in my favorite chair, overlooking the familiar garden that had survived generations, I whispered softly to myself, "Patience is my power, and silence is my voice. The house remembers, I remember, and someday justice will speak for both of us." The thought warmed me more than the fading sunlight ever could. For in that moment, I knew I was no longer just a resident of my home. I was its keeper, its defender, and its ultimate witness. Sitting in my chair, I let my mind drift back through the years, revisiting every corner of this house and every memory it held. This home was more than bricks and timber. It was a testament to a life built with care, sacrifice, and love. I had poured decades into it, nurturing it as one would nurture a family. Each room held stories, birthdays, anniversaries, quiet nights spent reading by the fire, laughter echoing through the hallways. Every piece of furniture, every decoration, every framed photograph represented a chapter of my life. And yet, all of that seemed to be dismissed as irrelevant in the eyes of those who now sought to overwrite my presence. I thought of my children, my precious children, who had grown up here under my watchful eyes. I had guided them, molded them, and tried to prepare them for the complexities of life, hoping they would carry forward not just our family's name, but its values. Yet, somewhere along the way, they had been influenced by someone who knew exactly how to whisper doubts, plant seeds of division, and make me appear obsolete. I thought of my children, my precious children, who had grown up here under my watchful eyes. I had guided them, molded them, and tried to prepare them for the complexities of life, hoping they would carry forward not just our family's name, but its values. Yet, somewhere along the way, they had been influenced by someone who knew exactly how to whisper doubts, plant seeds of division, and make me appear obsolete. I wasn't naive. I had noticed subtle changes, the way my advice was brushed aside, the way decisions about the house were suddenly made without consulting me, the way certain words from her were repeated in hushed tones until they sounded like truth in their ears. The betrayal stung deeply, but it also sharpened my resolve. I recalled the early years of this home when the walls were bare and the floors were cold. Every nail hammered, every coat of paint brushed, every garden bed planted had been done with sweat and determination. I had seen storms pass over these windows, both literal and figurative. Life had tested me countless times, and yet here I was, facing yet another storm, but with far more clarity and strategy than ever before. I understood now that the strength required to protect what is yours is not loud or violent. It is methodical, patient, and unwavering. I remembered the subtle manipulations that had crept into our family over the years. A misplaced document here, a whispered criticism there, a decision taken without my knowledge. Each act seemed minor when viewed in isolation, but together they formed a pattern, an attempt to rewrite my role, to render me invisible. And yet, invisibility is a dangerous assumption. Just because someone cannot see you does not mean you do not exist. And just because someone believes they have the upper hand does not mean the game is theirs to win. In my reflection, I also remembered the relationships I had cultivated over the years beyond these walls. Trusted friends, neighbors, and even professionals who had seen the way I carried myself, who recognized the integrity in my actions. These connections were not just social niceties. They were a network of silent support, a safety net that I could rely upon when the time came to assert myself. I realize now that the resources I had overlooked, thinking them unimportant, would become essential tools in the quiet reclamation of my life. Even as I thought about the present chaos, the boxes on the lawn, the smirks, the dismissive words, I could not allow anger to cloud my judgment. Anger is loud, it is rash, and it often leads to mistakes. Instead, I let a calm determination settle over me, a steady fire that would guide each step I needed to take. Every move she made to unsettle me became a marker, a clue, a piece of the strategy I was beginning to outline in my mind. I would respond not with confrontation, but with precision, not with noise, but with results. In the game she thought she controlled, I had already claimed the first advantage, the knowledge that I could endure, and endure I would. The memories of this home were also reminders of resilience. Every hardship, every disagreement, every challenge I had faced within these walls had been met with patience and fortitude. I had seen children grow, neighbors leave, seasons change, and still this home stood, steady, resilient, and enduring. It was a reflection of myself. And now, as I considered the present turmoil, I recognized that this home and I shared the same qualities, rooted, steadfast, and capable of weathering whatever storm approached. Finally, I reflected on the lessons I had learned about trust and family. Love, I realized, does not guarantee loyalty, and proximity does not ensure understanding. People are fallible, influenced by pride, ambition, and deception. Yet, in understanding these truths, I discovered a power that is often overlooked, the power to observe, to wait, to plan, and ultimately to act with precision when the time is right. This power, built through experience and tempered by patience, would be the instrument with which I would reclaim what was rightfully mine. As the afternoon light faded and the shadows lengthened across the rooms I had once arranged with care, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The house had seen laughter and sorrow, triumph and failure, and it would witness this next chapter as well. I knew now that the story of being forgotten was not over, and that my return to rightful place would not loud, but it would be absolute. In the silence of reflection, I planned my quiet revolution. The day would come when every slight, every act of disrespect would be met with measured, undeniable justice. And I would be restored not only in my home, but in my children's eyes and in the memory of all who mattered. It was the discovery that changed everything. Hidden among the stacks of papers I had overlooked in my study, I found evidence of manipulation that went far beyond my initial suspicions. Documents had been altered, signatures forged, and decisions regarding the property quietly shifted without my consent. The weight of betrayal pressed down, but it no longer paralyzed me. It ignited a focused determination. Every alteration was a roadmap, every omission a clue, every misstep by them a potential advantage I could use to reclaim my home and my dignity. I spent hours examining each piece of evidence, careful not to let my emotions cloud my judgment. The more I uncovered, the clearer the pattern became. My daughter-in-law had orchestrated a systematic attempt to erase me, to control not just the home, but the narrative of my life. It was audacious, and in her arrogance, she had left enough traces for me to follow. Each piece of paper, each note, each small irregularity was a thread, and I began weaving them together into a tapestry that revealed the full extent of the scheme. The sense of betrayal was sharp, cutting through me like a knife, yet I allowed it to settle into calm resolve. I could not rush. The situation demanded patience, strategy, and subtlety. I reached out to a trusted ally, a family friend who had always been discreet and observant, someone who could verify the irregularities without raising alarms. We spent long afternoons reviewing each document, confirming details and planning the steps necessary to respond. The slow accumulation of knowledge was empowering. For the first time in months, I felt the scales of control begin to tip. Meanwhile, the household continued as though nothing was happening. My daughter-in-law flaunted her temporary victories, unaware that her actions were being cataloged, assessed, and countered in my mind. She believed that her dominance was unchallenged, that my silence was submission. How easily arrogance blinds the unobservant. I took careful note of her patterns, her timings, her interactions with my children and neighbors. Every smile she thought triumphant, every condescending glance, every whispered command became part of a dossier in my head, a mental map of opportunities to regain what had been taken. Even my children had been influenced, their perspectives subtly swayed by repeated small manipulations. But I had faith in their capacity for understanding. The truth, when presented clearly and indisputably, has a way of breaking through even the most persistent of false narratives. I prepared myself to reveal the reality of events in a way that was undeniable, leaving no room for misinterpretation or dismissal. Strategy, not confrontation, would be my tool. Days turned into weeks as I meticulously planned each step. I considered legal avenues, documented every irregularity, and consulted quietly with the few who could assist without alerting her. The patience that had always been a quiet companion in my life was now a powerful instrument. I knew the precise moment when observation would transition into action, when preparation would become execution, and that moment was approaching. At night, when the house settled and the world outside seemed indifferent, I allowed myself to imagine the reversal, the precise point when control would return to me. I pictured her confusion, the astonishment of those who had doubted me, the quiet satisfaction of setting things right without resorting to confrontation. Each imagined scenario reinforced my confidence and sharpened my resolve. I was no longer simply reacting to her actions. I was orchestrating a calculated return, informed by knowledge, patience, and the unshakable belief in my own worth. The turning point came subtly, almost imperceptible. A misfiled document, a neglected deadline, a minor overconfidence on her part, all elements that I had anticipated and could now exploit. I began the process of reclaiming control in small, deliberate moves. Each act was measured, leaving no room for error, no opportunity for her to regain advantage. It was a quiet campaign, but one that promised complete victory if executed with precision and resolve. By the end of the third week, I could sense the subtle shifts in the household. A glance here, a hesitant word there, a slight hesitance in the way she carried herself. I did not celebrate prematurely, for victory demanded patience to be complete, but the first signs of reversal were unmistakable. My home, my family, and my dignity were no longer threatened by unchecked arrogance. The foundation for restoration had been laid, and I was ready to see it through to its inevitable conclusion. The day I moved from observation to action felt ordinary on the surface, which suited me perfectly. I did not want spectacle. I wanted results. I began with small, undeniable steps that would slowly tighten around the truth until there was no escaping it. First, I formalized what I had found. I organized every altered page, every note, every instance of interference into a clean chronological file. I labeled each item with dates and context, not for show, but so that nothing could be dismissed as confusion or coincidence. When evidence is presented with clarity, it becomes impossible to ignore. Next, I sought out people who had witnessed the changes without realizing their significance. There were neighbors who had seen my daughter-in-law show up with contractors, signing papers that should have been discussed at the family table. There was a former clerk who remembered a name signed in haste. There were friends who had been on the receiving end of frantic calls asking for advice about selling or transferring property. I approached each person gently, not to pressure, but to explain. Many were surprised and saddened, but most were willing to help once they understood the stakes. Their corroboration would be small in isolation, but together it formed a pattern no one could credibly deny. I also made careful, discreet inquiries with professionals I trusted. A solicitor I had known for years reviewed the documents and shook her head once, not in condemnation, but in resigned understanding. The signatures had been altered, the timelines manipulated, the explanations contrived. She advised me with measured words, reminding me that truth presented meticulously and patiently often has more power than anger. Her counsel was practical and precise. We discussed the steps that would assert my rights without creating unnecessary conflict. The plan was to let the facts speak in a setting where they could not be ignored. As the preparations progressed, I played a quiet role in the household that betrayed me. I continued my routines with deliberate normalcy. I baked the same bread, tended the same plants, and kept the same light on in the study long after she had gone to bed. Routine can soothe others and mask strategy. She, convinced of her victory, occasionally loosened her guard. And in those moments, small mistakes emerged. A meeting planned without proper notice, a contract signed without legal counsel present, a witness who suddenly recalled a conversation. Each slip was noted, added to the file, and held like a card at the ready. The turning point that sealed the path to restoration did not come from confrontation. It came from a quiet hearing at a small office with a notary and 2 witnesses. I presented the evidence with calm explanation, each document laid out so clearly that the room required no imagination to understand it. The notary asked questions, confirmed dates, and observed the discrepancies. One by one, I watched assumptions shift. The notary was not a dramatist, but her recognition of the inconsistencies carried weight. The simplest admission from a neutral observer can scatter a house of cards. Word of the formal review spread, not by my design, but by the careful discretion of those I had involved. When my children learned of the notary meeting, they came to see me with concern etched on their faces. They had been torn between loyalty and doubt for some time, and the evidence provided the clarity they needed. The notary asked questions, confirmed dates, and observed the discrepancies. One by one, I watched assumptions shift. The notary was not a dramatist, but her recognition of the inconsistencies carried weight. The simplest admission from a neutral observer can scatter a house of cards. Word of the formal review spread, not by my design, but by the careful discretion of those I had involved. When my children learned of the notary meeting, they came to see me with concern etched on their faces. They had been torn between loyalty and doubt for some time, and the evidence provided the clarity they needed. I did not demand immediate apologies or theatrical reconciliations. I wanted the truth to settle into their minds like clear water into a jar. They reviewed the materials I had compiled, asked questions, and slowly began to see the pattern for what it was. In their eyes, I could read shame, confusion, and a dawning respect that replaced the years of dismissive certainty. With the family reoriented, I moved to secure formal protections. Legal filings followed the measured advice I had been given. Paperwork was submitted to prevent any immediate transfers of property and to require proper notice for any changes moving forward. The language was precise and limited in scope. I did not seek to punish. I sought to prevent further erasure and to ensure that any decisions about our home would be made openly and lawfully. There is a dignity in restraint, and I was determined to preserve it. When she realized that the tide had turned, she tried to reclaim the narrative with loud accusations and frantic explanations. She staged a scene one evening in front of neighbors, accusing me of betrayal, of fabricating documents, of playing games. I listened without interruption. The louder someone becomes, the more obvious the fissures in their story. Her accusations felt like a child throwing stones in a glass house. Neighbors who had once admired her composure now looked for the cracks. Her performance, meant to intimidate, only served to confirm the doubts that had begun to take a root. The decisive moment arrived at a small family meeting where facts could not be elided by theatrics or charm. I laid out the chronology, the altered documents, and the corroborations from witnesses. I spoke plainly, without rancor, focusing on what had happened and what needed to be done next. The room held its breath. No one expected a public spectacle. They expected explanations, something they could weigh and act upon. When the truth was presented calmly and fully, the reaction was inevitable. Apologies were offered, not always immediately and not always fully, but they began. More importantly, decisions were made to correct the records and to restore rightful ownership and authority. I remember the quiet relief that followed. It was not triumphant noise, but a soft, collective exhale. The house reclaimed a sense of order as paperwork was corrected and promises were put in writing. Some relationships needed time to heal, and some words could not be unsaid, yet the essential wrong had been addressed. I felt a deep, steady satisfaction that had nothing to do with vengeance. It was the satisfaction of justice done with dignity. In the days that followed, life resumed its quieter rhythms. The plants I had tended seemed to lean toward the light a little more readily. My children were present in ways they had not been for some time, not out of obligation, but from a renewed understanding. The daughter-in-law retreated into a smaller role, her influence waning as accountability took its place. I had not sought to humiliate her, and I would not revel in her decline. My aim had always been restoration, not ruin. Sitting in the same chair where I had first watched my belongings stacked on the lawn, I felt the house breathe with me. It was as if the walls themselves recognized the return of balance. The turning point had been less about a single action and more about a series of patient, deliberate choices that together formed an unassailable truth. I had learned to turn observation into strategy and strategy into quiet triumphs. The home that had almost forgotten me now remembered, and in that remembrance lay the deepest form of justice. The day everything settled into its rightful place arrived with little fanfare, which suited me perfectly. I had never wanted spectacle. I had wanted truth, clarity, and the restoration of what was rightfully mine. The hearing was scheduled in a small conference room at the municipal office, a neutral place where facts were weighed and records were kept. There were 6 people in the room aside from us, a mediator, a clerk, 2 witnesses I had called, my solicitor, and my son. My daughter-in-law arrived late, as if timing could lend her a kind of borrowed authority. She carried herself with the same practiced composure she had used for months, but under the surface, the calm was thinner than it once seemed. I laid my documents on the table with steady hands. Each file was organized, annotated, and dated. The mediator looked through them carefully and then looked up at me with an expression that mixed professional concern with genuine empathy. There was no room for theatrics here. The papers spoke plainly, and that plainness was my greatest ally. The clerk verified signatures and timestamps, confirming the inconsistencies we had uncovered. One by one, the threads of manipulation were exposed, not as speculation, but as verifiable fact. My daughter-in-law tried to control the narrative as she often had, interjecting with rehearsed indignation and accusations of misunderstanding. I let her speak, and when she finished, I answered with calm precision. I recounted the sequence of events, pointing to dates, to alterations, to witnesses who had seen parts of the scheme unfold. There was no malice in my tone. There was only a measured recounting of truth. The more plainly I spoke, the more obvious it became that truth required no embellishment to carry the day. When the witnesses I had called gave their statements, it felt less like a courtroom drama and more like a settling of accounts. A neighbor affirmed seeing contractors arrive with plans and signatures that had been misrepresented. A former clerk described a hurried action that did not follow protocol. Even small confirmations like these, offered calmly and without spectacle, assembled into an undeniable pattern. I watched my son listen, and I felt the slow, steady shift in him as comprehension replaced the fog of doubt. It was heartening and painful at once. The wounds of deception had been real, and the process of unmaking them required patient work. The mediator recommended corrective filings and the immediate reversal of any unauthorized transfers. The clerk prepared the necessary paperwork, and the solicitor I trusted drafted precise language to secure my rights until full legal review could be completed. It was not a dramatic eviction or a public shaming. It was procedural, methodical, and absolute in its effect. The documents that attempted to overwrite my life were nullified in part, and procedures were put in place to prevent further unilateral actions. The house, the place of my memories, was legally acknowledged as under my protection once more. What felt like the climax was not the signing of papers, but the small, quiet moments that followed. My son, who had been bewildered and torn for months, stood beside me and, without flourish, reached for my hand. His grip was awkward and sincere. He did not have to say much. The apology was in his eyes and in the gentle pressure of his fingers. It was more than words, and it felt more honest for being modest. My daughter-in-law retreated into strained silence. Her composure faltered when she realized that the ordinary people she had manipulated, neighbors, clerks, and friends, no longer accepted her performance as truth. There was a temptation to revel in her defeat, to make the moment about poetic justice. I resisted. Justice done with dignity is not a spectacle for revenge. It is a careful, quiet righting of wrongs. I watched as she gathered her things later that evening, leaving in a way that was neither dramatic nor triumphant. The absence of her presence in the house felt at first oddly hollow, and then gradually like relief. The air seemed cleaner, as though a long-held tension had finally been allowed to dissipate. Neighbors came by over the following days. Some offered quiet condolences for the pain I had endured. Others brought small gifts of comfort, a casserole, a bundle of fresh herbs, a note recalling a long-forgotten kindness. The gestures were ordinary, and that ordinariness suited the mood of restitution. It was not the applause of strangers I sought. It was the restoration of everyday decency, the knowledge that the house would continue to be a home rather than a battleground. Rebuilding the interior life of the family required time, patience, and honest conversation. My son and I spoke at length, not in the heat of accusation, but in the cool light of reconstruction. We discussed decisions that would be made together, boundaries that needed to be clarified, and ways to prevent future manipulation. It was a practical, adult conversation about governance and respect. There were no dramatic proclamations, only the slow, steady work of reweaving trust. I also reached out to those who had been manipulated by her charm and persuasion. Some expressed regret, others defensiveness, and a few offered sincere apologies. I accepted what felt genuine and held space for those still learning. Forgiveness, I had learned, is not a single act, but a practice that must be chosen repeatedly. Where apology was absent, I left the space open and quiet. Where remorse was offered, I accepted it with cautious warmth. The goal was not to erase the past, but to create a future in which the past no longer dictated the terms. There were lessons that extended beyond the walls of my home. People I had once considered distant acquaintances became allies in small ways, offering support and validation. The absence of her presence in the house felt, at first, oddly hollow, and then, gradually, like relief. The air seemed cleaner, as though a long-held tension had finally been allowed to dissipate. Neighbors came by over the following days. Some offered quiet condolences for the pain I had endured. Others brought small gifts of comfort, a casserole, a bundle of fresh herbs, a note recalling a long-forgotten kindness. The gestures were ordinary, and that ordinariness suited the mood of restitution. It was not the applause of strangers I sought. It was the restoration of everyday decency, the knowledge that the house would continue to be a home rather than a battleground. Rebuilding the interior life of the family required time, patience, and honest conversation. My son and I spoke at length, not in the heat of accusation, but in the cool light of reconstruction. We discussed decisions that would be made together, boundaries that needed to be clarified, and ways to prevent future manipulation. It was a practical, adult conversation about governance and respect. There were no dramatic proclamations, only the slow, steady work of reweaving trust. I also reached out to those who had been manipulated by her charm and persuasion. Some expressed regret, others defensiveness, and a few offered sincere apologies. I accepted what felt genuine and held space for those still learning. Forgiveness, I had learned, is not a single act, but a practice that must be chosen repeatedly. Where apology was absent, I left the space open and quiet. Where remorse was offered, I accepted it with cautious warmth. The goal was not to erase the past, but to create a future in which the past no longer dictated the terms. There were lessons that extended beyond the walls of my home. People I had once considered distant acquaintances became allies in small ways, offering support and validation. The realization that a network of ordinary people can act as a bulwark against manipulation warmed me. I had always believed in community, but now I understood the practical power of it. The house was protected not because I was louder than others, but because the truth was presented clearly and the people around me bore witness. One evening, as I walked through the rooms that had once been spread across the lawn like discarded things, I ran my hands along familiar surfaces and felt the quiet contentment that comes from work done well. The photographs on the mantel held faces I loved, the beds were made with linens I had chosen, and the garden outside still held bursts of color from plants I had tended for years. These were small, ordinary confirmations of a life that had survived an attempt at erasure. The climax had not been a dramatic showdown. It had been a return to ordinary dignity. I slept that night with a sense of calm I had not felt in months. The house hummed with ordinary sounds, pipes settling, the night wind in the oak, a distant dog barking, and each sound felt like a thread in a tapestry that had been mended. Justice had been done not as revenge, but as restoration. I had not sought to destroy, I had sought to preserve, and in that preservation lay the true victory. In the quiet weeks after the hearing, the house felt like a place regaining its breath. Small things returned first. The morning light found its way through curtains I had sewn years ago. The kettle whistled at the same hour it always had. Neighbors waved with new ease, and the garden, which had been trampled by hurried feet and careless boxes, began to bloom again under my careful hands. Restoration is often a sequence of small acts, and I took them one by one, as if each task stitched a seam back into the fabric of our lives. My son and I spoke more honestly than we had for a long time. There was a humility in his voice that had not existed before, an admission that pride and persuasion had clouded his judgment. He did not make grand promises, and neither did I demand them. We rearranged responsibilities, clarified boundaries, and agreed on practical steps to prevent another person from manipulating our family's decisions. It was, at times, awkward and slow, the work of two people learning to trust in the aftermath of deceit. Yet those quiet conversations felt truer than any declaration we might have made in the heat of anger. The daughter-in-law kept her distance. She moved into a smaller apartment and made rare attempts at contact. Some of those attempts were awkward apologies offered with the same air of entitlement that had once carried her through a room. I accepted what felt sincere and maintained distance where it did not. Forgiveness, I reminded myself, is not a public performance. It is a choice that preserves dignity while recognizing the real cost of betrayal. I wanted healing that was honest rather than hurried, and so I allowed time and consistency to do what rants and recriminations never could. Neighbors who had once hesitated to speak up now offered help in the simplest ways. A plate of soup left on my doorstep, a note recalling a memory of my late husband and a kindness he once showed. These gestures were not dramatic, but they mattered. They signaled that the life we had rebuilt was rooted in ordinary human decency, and that was more sustaining than any theatrical vindication. Community, I realized, was not a convenience but a shield, and its small, steady kindnesses were more protective than any dramatic speech. I also turned inward. There is a peculiar solitude in reflecting on the seasons of a life. I walked through rooms and listened to the echoes of my past choices, recognizing both the joys and the blind spots. I thought about the ways I had perhaps allowed others to assume control without insisting on clarity sooner. I forgave myself for mistakes and made notes for the future. Wisdom, I learned, is not simply knowing what to do, but learning from when you did not know and changing how you move forward. In quiet moments, I revisited the journal my husband had kept for years. His handwriting was a familiar map to a younger time, to promises made in younger, more hopeful seasons. The notes spoke of a life built together and the expectation that love would govern the choices their children made. Reading those lines felt like receiving counsel from beyond the years. I held on to that counsel when navigating difficult conversations. It kept my actions aligned with the person I intended to be, not the person anger might make me for a moment. There were practical matters to attend to as well. Legal measures needed monitoring, and paperwork required follow-up. I met with the solicitor occasionally to ensure that the protections we had put in place remained effective and that any future transfers or changes would require clear consent and proper procedure. I did not want the business of restoration to be left to chance. The quiet diligence of administration is rarely romantic, but it is the backbone of lasting solutions. As the weeks became months, the household resumed a gentler rhythm. Meals were shared with a renewed awareness of one another. The television, which had once been a background hum throughout dinners, was used less and conversation more. My children brought home small stories from their days, and we listened without judgment. It was ordinary life, stitched carefully back together, and its ordinariness felt sacred. Sometimes I would catch myself watching the sun move across the kitchen floor and feel a fierce gratitude for the ordinariness of mornings. I thought of the younger women who worked hard and kept household lives afloat with little recognition. I thought of the older neighbors who had quietly supported me in small ways. In those reflections, I found a stronger sense of purpose, to speak for the dignity of ordinary life and to remind others that being seen is sometimes the bravest act. There were moments, of course, when old wounds surfaced. A comment from a relative, a question that betrayed lingering doubt, or a glance that still carried the shadow of past manipulation. When those moments came, I practiced a different kind of strength. I allowed myself to feel the sting, then to let it pass. Resentment can calcify into bitterness, which corrodes more than any adversary ever could. I chose instead to be guided by firmness and compassion, to make decisions that reflected long-term well-being rather than immediate satisfaction. Slowly, the house became less a battleground and more a place of memory and care. I hosted a small tea for neighbors and friends, not to parade victory but to celebrate ordinary kindness. People brought stories instead of gossip, and laughter arrived in small increments. I watched as children chased each other across the yard, oblivious to the dramas that had unfolded months before. Their joy felt like a promise that life, despite its ruptures, continues to renew itself. The experience taught me that silence can be a strategy, not merely a surrender. It taught me that patience is a form of strength, especially when paired with careful observation and deliberate action. It taught me the importance of building networks of trust, of documenting truths, and of insisting on clarity in matters that affect one's home and dignity. These lessons were not abstract. They were practical tools I could pass on to others who might one day find themselves doubted or dismissed. In time, I returned to the practices that had sustained me for years, tending the garden, writing notes for my grandchildren, patching quilts with hands that had sewn for decades. There is a rhythm to such tasks that calms the mind and centers the heart. They are actions of care rather than reaction, and they rebuilt my sense of self more thoroughly than any victory could. On an autumn afternoon, as leaves turned and the air sharpened with the promise of change, my son and I stood in the garden and watched the light shift across the beds we had tended together. He placed a hand briefly on my shoulder and said simply, "Thank you." I did not need more than that. The words were enough because they were unforced and true. I had not set out to be a lesson for others. I had set out to live my life with dignity and to protect what was mine. Yet the arc of the months that followed had made me witness to the quiet ways justice can arrive. In the end, the house remembered what I had always been. It remembered my care, my patience, and my refusal to be erased. That remembrance was, I realized, the deepest and most enduring kind of justice.